Let me very quickly introduce our stellar line of speakers for the first part of the webinar. There are longer bios on the webinar of the Minerva Center in Haifa, and so I keep it really short in order not to take more time. First, we have Pablo de Greif, who's a senior fellow at the School of Law of New York University. He is former and was the first UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Ruti Teitel is the Ernst C. Stiefel Professor of Comparative Law at New York Law School. Laila Hilal is a human rights lawyer and TJ expert, former legal advisor to Palestinian negotiators on the right of return and reparations. And last but not least, Daniel Levy, who's the president of the US Middle East Project and former member of the Israeli delegation to peace talks at Oslo and Taba. Daniel Levy and Ruti Teitel unfortunately have to leave after this part of the webinar, but they will catch up with the content online since it's recorded, and they will be here to answer your questions. So with this, I hand over to you, Pablo. The floor is yours. We very much look forward, and thanks again for joining.
On the contrary, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be doing this despite the circumstances, and I am very honored to be sharing the screen, as it were, with my very distinguished panelists. Since time is short, let me just say I will not talk about the particular case. I was asked to talk about transitional justice from a global perspective and to think, first of all, about the aims. The field continues to be, from my standpoint, under-theorized, and of course it's very difficult to establish relationship between means and ends without a theory. I had proposed one a while ago that argues that the four basic pillars of transitional justice, truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, share certain aims. Each one of them has a specific purpose, but they share some ends. First, to provide recognition to victims, and not just to their suffering, but to provide recognition to victims as rights bearers. Second, that all the transitional justice measures are meant to promote a certain type of civic trust, the trust in institutions and trust in each other. Third, that all the measures are meant to strengthen the rule of law. And finally, that they are meant to promote social integration, or what some people prefer to call reconciliation. Obviously, this is not to argue that the measures can do this on their own. I talk about different degrees of causal proximity or sufficiency with respect to these measures. Just to summarize, we can say that they are meant as contributions to these things. I was also asked to say something about the timeliness of transitional justice measures, and I will say that it's never early enough to do it, and that past experiences show the advantages of doing so. In Argentina and Chile, for example, where the original model of transitional justice, or what we now call transitional justice, took shape, people started collecting evidence and building files about the cases as they were happening. And for example, in Argentina, the files are collected by different social movements were absolutely crucial for the work of the first Truth Commission, the Commission on the Disappeared. So I think that this is an example of what can be done very early on, the collection of evidence and the building up of files. The other thing that people are paying increasing attention to, but I think more can be done, is to the dimension of mental health and psychosocial support. It is, of course, very well known that trauma travels intergenerationally, that the earlier you intervene, the more effective the interventions are. And finally, for justice purposes also, that the more people feel accompanied and supported, the greater their willingness is to participate in justice procedures. So quite aside from the fact that people need this on their own, and that would justify in itself the interventions, I think that there is an instrumental aim to be served by providing greater support for people that are in need. As part of the general question about timeliness, we have to acknowledge the model, as I said, I think took shape in the Latin American countries of the Southern Cone. These were all measures that were applied after the transition had taken place. Since then, of course, in many countries, including the one where I was born in Colombia, the measures have been applied while conflict is ongoing, and in many ways as a peace building tool. It is very difficult to do it, and I think that one should not unreflexively transpose the measures from a post-authoritarian setting to an ongoing conflict setting. Not all measures work equally well in all contexts, and therefore I think that there's some accommodations need to take place. And the final comment that I will make is that there is, despite the fact that there are some obvious areas of the world in which cross-border implementation of transitional justice measures would make perfect sense, the countries of the former Yugoslavia, the Great Lakes region in Africa, and of course, the region that occupies us today, Israel and Palestine, would be perfect places to try the cross-border implementation of transitional justice measures. The truth is that our experience in that area is very, very poor. We have, for example, the Timor-Leste Indonesia Friendship Commission, but I would not think of this as a stellar success. And otherwise, to be honest, efforts that were not completed and therefore whose final effects are difficult to judge. That, of course, should not prevent us from trying. And in that respect, I think that this discussion is very, very timely. But I would hope that the discussion would not take the shape simply of how to implement the very familiar measures unreformed in a conflict which is extremely, extremely difficult and very different from a post-authoritarian situation. And I will close here because the time is running out by sharing Shiran's hope that the humanity of the victims on both sides is fully, fully recognized and that this horrible conflict can come to an end soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for deliberating about the goals and the conditions and the sequence of how TJ processes can come into place. Let me now turn to Ruti. Ruti title. In the period before a political transition, what can be done to promote transitional justice?
Thank you so much, Anne, Sigal, Michal, and all of the team. I just returned from Jerusalem at Hebrew U, where I was teaching my colloquium on transitional justice during this very difficult time. I didn't do it last year when the war was in full force. And I would just want to start by saying that I was heartened by my time there, building on Pablo's comments. I brought in people from the Land for All and lawyers working on cases in Jerusalem, and I really came away with the importance of recognition, equal recognition towards reconciliation. And so, again, this has been mentioned already. What are we doing here, given the level of casualties in Gaza and the absence of accountability locally? Let me just respond to your question, which is obviously we are in a situation of anticipatory transitional justice, as was mentioned earlier. And so when I wrote about it in Globalizing TJ, I talked about the difference between the early years in Latin America or Argentina, where I'm from, where there was an actual political transition, and Chile as well. Here we are beyond the state and beyond the transition. So anticipatory transitional justice. And what we see is different actors turning to international institutions. So let me just give some examples. In some ways, the situation we're in is a failure of the international order. The UN Security Council has not been able to stop this war. It has not been able to stop the war in Ukraine, Russia, nor in Sudan. So from one side of the glass, you could say the glass is definitely half empty or more than half empty, because we are seeing a failure of the post-World War II security institutions because of the veto, because of the nature of the UN Security Council. On the other hand, it's interesting to see the creativity of actors involved in conflict, and especially in the global South. We saw a turn to the World Court, Ukraine, Russia in the early period, and also to the General Assembly calling for a Uniting for Peace resolution, which has been used in order to organize the opposition to Russia. And it has been very significant in terms of sanctions and different countries getting organized when in the absence of UNSC sanctions. We also saw a turn to the World Court by South Africa with respect to Israel. And there we saw that South Africa had standing to raise the consciousness on genocide. They called for, it was characterized this way because there was standing under the Genocide Convention. Could the court stop the war? No, it didn't call for an immediate ceasefire. On the other hand, the court found plausible rights for Palestine in the sense of the fact that Israel should stop the actions that were provisionally seen as potentially genocidal. They recognized the importance of humanitarian aid and for Israel to preserve evidence and also to make a report. This is an example. There have been other ICJ cases. Ukraine and Russia have both brought their challenges to the World Court. And we also have seen a turn to the International Criminal Court. What is the potential here? I want to raise at the end. Both Ukraine, Russia, there are ICC arrest warrants for crimes against humanity. I'm sorry, not Ukraine, but in that conflict, Putin and Belova for crimes against humanity for abduction. With respect to Israel, Palestine, you have Israel, Hamas, you have Netanyahu and Golan in November 2024, and you have Sinwar and Hanayeh and Masri Def. And, clearly these are seen on the Hamas side as no longer alive, but this definitely publicized the and documented crimes against humanity on the Hamas side, which is often challenged by those who are taking a political position. It was extremely important to have those cases. There are, of course, other ICC cases involving Sudan and other conflicts, which we don't have time to address. I want to add beyond that, these international institutions, we're seeing a broader influence of international normativity in the universality jurisdiction cases. And in particular, with respect to Syria, before the fall of Assad, we've seen a number of universal jurisdiction cases in Germany, Anwar Raslan and Al Gharib, in France, with Mehdi Nema and Chaban. A number of cases have gone forward on enforced disappearances. And also in Switzerland, with respect to Syria and Gambia, there have been a number of cases on crimes against humanity front. And so, we're seeing cases being brought in that regard, but also with respect to Israel-Palestine, there are new cases, challenges by October 7th justice organizations that are bringing cases on a universality basis for accomplices to Hamas. And then on the flip side, we've heard publicity with respect to foot soldiers, IDF, that are traveling, cases brought against them. My own view is that it's best to consider these cases as raising a consciousness at the time when it's not possible to have accountability domestically. And so it would be better to have the leaders involved in these challenges rather than those who were drafted and not necessarily where there isn't evidence of crimes against humanity and war crimes against them. I can turn to the impact of the potential of these modalities, if you will. Okay. And that is, I think, there are there's significant potential. The first and foremost is humanization of the victims. And this was something Pablo raised. And that definitely, once these cases, the South Africa case, it humanized and publicized the situation in Gaza at the time. And the flip side is that when you bring in the response to October 7th, the importance of humanization of victims on all sides. And for reconciliation, this is extremely important that there be recognition of both sides. The other aspect, which is extremely important and raised earlier, is documentation. We're talking intra-war. So this was something that, for example, the ICTY was able to do, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. It was during the conflict, it was not clear who the victors were, but it was extremely important to have documentation. The other is, and documentation preserving the evidence during war. Thirdly, we're talking about the possibility of lustration, of the fact that when you have indictments, you delegitimize those who are involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so that can often, even if it's anticipatory, it can go some way to jumpstarting political transition. This is what I hope. And that means that delegitimizing the Hamas that have been involved in October 7th and in related war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also on the Israeli side, delegitimizing the Netanyahu regime. And that is a third. And I would want to add another aspect to this is access to international institutions by less powerful states. The fact that we're seeing global South actors, even after a time when there was an avoidance of the international arena, you might say, a backlash to internationalism that we've seen around the world, right? Brexit, ethnic nationalism. Here we see that these other actors, less powerful states, are turning, backlash to the international arena. And I think this goes some way to legitimating international law. The notion that the international law is not just for the most powerful, but rather also for those who are less powerful and can, add to the legitimacy of the international legal order at a time when these institutions are clearly not functioning to help us, address the violence that we're seeing in a number of regions around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruti, for this. And I think we are going to pick up on several of those issues also later, just as with Pablo's speech. Let me turn now to Leila Hilal. Leila, you will be speaking in the beginning about Syria as a case study. And so I would like to ask you, during the Syrian civil war, Syrians in the diaspora were pushing for TJ in various ways, including by facilitating criminal investigations in third states, and discussing the need for truth and reconciliation in Syria. Can you say something about the diaspora engagement with TJ during the war and how this is impacting current discussions on TJ in post-Assad Syria?
I will say that in sort of setting up a comparison between Syria and Palestine, the two are completely incompatible. And transitional justice really is not applicable to the situation right now in Israel-Palestine. And I want to turn to that in a few minutes. Speaking to the situation of Syria, there was, significant displacement of Syrians, half the population, some 6 million persons were displaced. And civil society in Europe and the United States organized, self-organized, and ultimately organized into NGOs. And the core of their advocacy was around accountability for Assad regime officials. And there was significant pursuit of national cases, universal jurisdiction cases in France and Germany and the UK and other countries in Europe. And these cases advanced significantly. Syria is one of the most documented cases of mass atrocities, and including around the chain of command. So these national cases have been successful. Now, when there was the fall of the regime, the NGOs, Syrian diaspora NGOs, continued to advocate for transitional justice in Syria as a primary approach to national dialogue, reconciliation, and reform. They have not been as successful in penetrating this governance system established by the interim authorities because they're really sort of organized as NGOs around human rights principles and international norms. And that does not have resonance in the current context. They are also, calling for accountability for acts by Syrians, armed Syrians and others during the conduct of the war. And the controlling authorities are not open to questions of their own accountability.
Thank you.
Yes.
Laila, thank you so much for this already. If I may, because the time is actually almost up, could you give us some lessons since you have been involved in the Oslo process, could you also give us some lessons we can take from there?
Sure. So let's say during the Oslo process, we could have transitional justice could have been relevant in the Oslo process. Today, it's not. It was relevant, it could have been relevant in the context of Israel accepting responsibility for wrongdoing, excuse me. But the peace process was devised on the basis of compromise around land and territory, and the principle of separation, two peoples, two states, even though that was never intended to, a Palestinian state was never intended to be established. This question of accountability was completely dismissed as a basis for peace. So what that meant is that Israeli society never had to face legacy atrocities, namely the forced displacement of 2/3 of the Palestinian nation and the establishment of an exclusive apartheid regime, really from the river to the sea. So that was a lost opportunity. In the Geneva Accords went the farthest in sort of addressing or encroaching on the issue of accountability, but it was only partial acknowledgement, and only the only mechanism and relief, transitional justice relief, that was incorporated was a compensation, which was, it was a limited approach to transitioning from a state of conflict to a state of peace. Today, it's very important. Today, it's absolutely impossible to think about reconciliation, to think about mechanisms of transitional justice between Israelis and Palestinians. With 83% of the Israeli population supporting the forced expulsion of Palestinians, with the significant rise and resonance of the right wing, the annexation and expulsion, the genocide that's ongoing. I think, though, what we should be looking to are the issues of accountability and all of the mechanisms and opportunities, accountability and specifically criminal justice, lend to leveraging an end to the harms being done to Palestinians, enabling some kind of system of rule of law for the broader globe. I think a lot is at risk globally, given Israel's impunity in these horrific crimes. So I would urge transitional justice as a strategic political project amongst people that are mobilizing for a shared reality within Israel-Palestine as a whole. However, I think as political actors and advocates, we should stay focused on the issue of accountability, piercing Israeli impunity, and criminal justice.
Thank you so much, Laila, for your considerations. And I think Daniel will probably just tie into that. Since you have also been involved, Daniel, in the Oslo peace negotiations, can you also share your thoughts on the role of TJ in peace processes in general? And then more specifically about the decision to leave TJ out of the Oslo process. And I would also like to ask you, and I put my questions already so you can see how much time you want for each. Does the Syrian case provide any lessons for Israel-Palestine, especially in terms of diaspora engagement? Given that the diaspora may be in different roles, may be important to foster TJ processes within the country. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me thank you, Anne, and Sigal, and the organizers. I hope people can hear me okay. I will skip over the first thing. As I've mentioned, I'm not an expert in comparative transitional justice processes, so I won't share my ignorance with you. This has been bugging me for some time, which is why I was keen to take part in today, and why also, as has been mentioned, I apologize that I'll catch up on the rest of the sessions later, watching it online. But Layla's intervention just now helped me clarify what I've been grappling with, and I kind of started to I think, organize in my head as a consequence of thinking about this intervention in this webinar, which is, the more I reflect back on it, and I reflect from the vantage point of what we've been going through in these last months, truth and reconciliation, transitional justice were absolutely kept outside of the room at Oslo, and justice was kept outside of the room at Oslo, not just transitional justice. And it's hard not to draw the conclusion that that was part of the overall way in which Oslo reflected the asymmetry of power, and in never redressing that asymmetry of power was quite doomed to failure as an exercise in sustainable peacemaking. Because once you go down that path, as Leila just suggested to us, you inevitably have to open the 48 file, the Nakba file. And what do we do with it? And you kind of have to open the, what do you mean 67? The whole separation file. So it was by design. It was actually a fundamental underpinning of the Oslo design that there couldn't be truth and reconciliation elements there. There couldn't be transitional justice elements there. If one kind of wants to put it in slightly different language and be generous, then this was about addressing 67 and making sure we didn't go near 1948. And at the time, it seemed, maybe this was my naivety, quite natural that two of the phrases that hung most heavily in the air on the Israeli side were end of claims and end of conflict. Everything always had to be about getting the end of claims and the end of conflict. There's another end of which should have been central, but it was largely marginalized, which is end of occupation. But end of claims, particularly, was about putting to rest any possibility of justice, any possibility of the things that Leila just referred to. Now, I can't do the counterfactual in terms of whether had certain circumstances looked different, certain individuals behaved differently, perhaps one not being assassinated at the moment he was, whether that attempt at a quick fix in Oslo could have ended differently. Could we have actually got a border? Could we have got the kind of things that were being negotiated at one stage? What I think one can say with a much greater degree of confidence and certainty is that to the extent to which a quick fix, which tried to say, here's a situation that arose in 67, it's not at the heart of all of the conflict, but at least we could address that. To try and do that from the perspective of today is impossible. You can't go back to that. Now, I think it also speaks a little bit, and maybe more than a little bit, to this core question of partition and separation. And, what Leila just said, and I'm sorry, Leila, I keep going over your ground, but unsurprisingly, perhaps it's something that I could identify with a lot. The question of reconciliation does feel more pertinent in a civil war situation, in a situation where people are going to have to live together again, rather than a situation where people are going to be separated, which of course would also have been imperfect, because it leaves hanging in the air, wait a minute, what about the status of the 20% of Israelis who are Palestinian? Some of them themselves internally displaced from the Nakba. I mean, when I was in government, we still used to talk about Ikrit and Biram, and whether those villages could be recognized, there could be some kind of historical justice just for those two communities. And those things never got off the ground. What Leila referred to in the Geneva Initiative, which, as you say, was an imperfect, but the closest thing to at least looking under the plaster of that wound, not ripping off the plaster, was that we used a word called refugeehood. So we didn't go down the path of restitution and reparations, really, but one that went down a much more direct path of compensation and an acknowledgement of refugeehood. So I guess drawing a line under this, my reflection is that Once you open that up, and at this stage, I think one does have to open it up, you are in a place that Israel was conspicuously never willing to go to. And I'm not sure that you can ever get something that approximates a just, dignified peace unless you go there. Because it's part of Israel coming to terms with the Palestinians. And what it has enabled, what ignoring this has enabled, I think there is a direct line between that and what we see today, which is the attempt at a second Nakba and worse. And so there's been this attempt to go from Nakba 1 to Nakba 2 without ever acknowledging that there was a Nakba or that there was some issue of justice or acknowledgement that had to be resolved, which leaves me to close with two things, which is in my not sufficiently deep knowledge of the field, that leaves us with two things. One is when we think about the situation today, accountability from the outside, or these bottom-up civil society processes of transitional justice in the more truth and reconciliation sense, as a way of creating new space for understanding, new space for different kind of dialogue, of coming to terms, of rehumanizing. That couldn't be more necessary, but it feels so divorced from the planet that we live on, which to me doesn't mean that at some stage we don't go back there, because I think at the moment we're kind of in a space where either it's zero sum, and right now it looks like zero sum would be the completing the job of the annihilation of the Palestinian people. But I would suggest that there is a degree of fragility to Israeli society that is not the only possible zero sum outcome. And I think Israelis should not feel quite so hubristic that their future is guaranteed and is going to be gloriously happy in the trajectory we are on. So it's either zero sum or it's some kind of coming to terms with each other. And in that respect, maybe in the future, there is space for that. In the meantime, it's the externally imposed tools of justice that matter most. Those have been discussed extensively by others. Those are the things that are of the most salience and relevance today, because the question one has to grapple with today is, how does one prevent this genocide from extending further? And all I would say in respect of that is I would argue that the extent to which if you measure the extent of the Israeli pushback against the ICC, against the ICJ, that this has been so important to rally the Americans round on. The stories that have now been unearthed of the threats and the intimidation against the former prosecutor general at the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, when they first started looking into Israeli war crimes. We're talking long before October 7th. The reports that the head of the Mossad showed up in a meeting she was having with a third party to intimidate that chief prosecutor. That tells me that this is what could shift the balance of impunity, accountability, the incentive structure, the costs and consequences. And therefore, for me, it feels like there is insufficient emphasis on one of the things that the ICJ in its provisional measures in January of 2024 in the South Africa genocide case already called for, which is preserving evidence. And I think there could have been much more of an emphasis, and there could still today be more of an emphasis on doing that. The kinds of works of the Hind Rajab Foundation and others to hold Israeli soldiers individually accountable. I think one of the things that states should be looking at is whether Israelis traveling should have to sign declarations that they were not involved in the commissioning of war crimes, and things like that, which I think are pertinent to what needs to be done right now. But let me pause there.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks so much to the whole panelists for your considerations and deliberations here. So I have one question, and I myself would also have one, but I would also like to encourage you to ask each other on certain issues. I start with that question, and I basically read it. So we have one participant called Heidi. Perhaps I'm a bit naive, but always thought of TJ as a brilliant solution to impossible situations. However, all the speakers seem very pessimistic about applying TJ to the current situation. Can any of the speakers offer recommendations or suggestions of how to use TJ to move forward? And if I can piggyback on that, I would like to pressure you a little bit more on your thoughts about the role of the diaspora, what the role of the Syrian diaspora, which includes narratives, which includes, and I think in Syria that was very important, was the preservation of evidence, as we have just heard from Daniel, which was so important. So maybe you can also pick this up, and I can see Daniel already wants to speak to that, but I would also like to ask Leila to come back to that, and also all of you actually, Pablo also in a comparative perspective, that would be marvelous. Thank you.
So I just, because I meant to say it, and you just reminded me of that, so I'll say this very briefly. The point that I had wanted to make is, I wonder if one is kind of leaping far ahead for a moment about how, if we're not in zero sum, when eventually we're not in a zero sum space and both peoples are going to inhabit this land, my thought was, is there salience to what is going to be an increasing fact of life, which is of a much larger Israeli diaspora? Because according to all the anecdotal evidence, more Israelis are living and more will continue to move and live outside of Israel in significant measure because of the consequences of what's going on now, and that will be a cohort of Israelis still deeply tied into Israeli society, but many of whom will be coming from the more uncomfortable with what Israel has done, critical thinking space. And that's where I just wondered whether that gives you something to begin to think about, introducing more aspects of justice and how we think about the past and who Israelis think that they are. And that's why it was interesting for me, what you'd skipped over, Leila, given the time, on your experience with Syrian diaspora organizing. But it may not be relevant to this. I acknowledge it may not.
And before we go on, I think Laila wanted to say something. We don't have much time, and Pablo also, Ruti as well. But before you answer, Ruti, and you will have the last word, we have another question, whether it's realistically possible to apply TJ without putting pressure from the international actors. I think you, in a way, have already answered it, but you might want to make that even stronger. Leila, I have you. So now we go backwards partially. Leila, on the diaspora, maybe.
Yeah, just quickly on the case of the Syrian diaspora. I mean, one of the biggest challenges for the diaspora to have a role in Syria is, related to really their NGOization in the diaspora. And they need to go through a process of politicization, and we need more party formation in Syria in order to move the needle, essentially. And so the diaspora has had an important role in building external alliances with the UN and other, the European Union and others that are, having an impact on prioritizing transitional justice. And the new regime has, announced a commission to deal with transitional justice. But I think, the challenge for Syrian diaspora is to be able to play politics in Syria. And and for space to open up for the organization of parties. In the case of Israel-Palestine, I think American Jews are playing a very specific role, a very important role in creating a context in which potentially Israeli Jews can start to come to terms with the fact that with the legacy crimes and with the fact that separation is not the paradigm through which we will get to peace and justice.
Thank you so much, Laila. Ruti and no, Pablo. Pablo, you go first, please, and take your time.
So just very briefly, I'm insisting that I don't think that the transitional justice is a silver bullet or that it can be applied in an identical fashion from one place to another. But I do want to say a couple of things. First, it is empirically demonstrable that peace agreements that include human rights components are much more sustainable than those that do not. So this I address both to Daniel and in a certain sense to Leila. I am not that I am naively optimistic, but for example, my former colleague Caitlin Reiger in her book on prosecuting heads of state showed how between 1995 and 2009, 39 heads of state were prosecuted and charged and declared guilty of crimes, including, for example, Alberto Fujimori in Peru. So it's this is not a prediction, but I am absolutely sure that none of those heads of state ever imagined that they would end up being prosecuted and declared guilty. So I don't think that one should lose hope. And finally, I don't think that we should reduce the discussion to criminal accountability. I think that there's a lot that can be done for victims, and that doing things for victims and in the public sphere in general also increases the demand for accountability. So I wouldn't be totally pessimistic. And the final point is, Daniel, let's not forget that Europe as a whole had to go through a process of mutual reconciliation after the Second World War. So this is not just a need for countries in civil war. It took more than 20 years for the Frankfurt trials to take place after the end of the war. But it did happen, and sometimes even across national borders, it happens to be successful. So not to end up on a downer, I think this takes time, but that there is potential for it.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for your positive note, and I share that. Ruti, last word for you, and maybe also concerning the international actors and
yes, well, that was my presentation, and I do think that the turn to the international institutions and actors reflect that people do think that this is significant. It publicizes, it preserves the evidence, and it delegitimizes certain actors on both sides. Okay, and I want to come back to that things often have to get so bad before there's change. And I know Pablo would agree with that we, you couldn't predict many of the transitions that have occurred, the big ones, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, what happened in Latin America, when the military were going to collapse in different countries. And often there was deep state for a while, right? In Chile and so on. So we don't have those predictions, but I want to say, having come back from the region and being very heartened by groups working together. So this is the civil society piece of it, right? The international accountability and publicity, but also groups like Omdim Yachad standing together, blocking settlers from attacking Palestinians, standing up to the IDF where they are being passive. Groups like A Land for All that have a belief in a confederal system, that there will be confederal constitution. And I really do think that a horrible tragedy like October 7th has unfortunately reflected that doing nothing is not an option. So that's something that now Israelis know. And Netanyahu also knows this, that, his strategy of just throwing money at Hamas, avoiding a Palestinian state, everyone I talk to has come to that conclusion. And so this is a very significant turning point. And so that's how these groups that are operating from mutual grief are giving each other mutual recognition. And so, I'm hoping that this will be a turning point in the region. And we see violence in a number of regions because we're no longer in a global, in a bipolar U.S.-Soviet system. There's a lot of violence in a number of regions. Unfortunately, we're going to be in that point for some time, but I somehow think we're at a turning point there. So we'll see. We'll see. Thank you all for this very important conversation. I've learned a lot from all of you. Yeah.
So this was a terrific start. Thank you all for our stellar speakers for this discussion. And I'm sure we're going to pick up some of those points in the second part of the panel.